Welcome to the Clandestine Radio Podcast, Season 3.
Good evening, curious minds out there across the world, and welcome back for Season 3 of the Clandestine Radio Podcast. As always, I'm your host, DJ Chazwa, and you are finally tuned in to Season 3, Episode 1, Who Killed the Kennedys? Part 1, JFK. Hopefully, you guys have been looking forward to this episode, or at least for the show to come back. I know that I have. Really miss you guys. And it's great to be back in here. I've got lots of very interesting cases that I'm looking forward to bringing to you this season, starting with this one. And this is one of the biggest cases that I've ever even considered trying to cover on this podcast. It was such a pivotal event in the country's history, and its effects are still felt to this day. This was the true birth of the CIA using conspiracy theory, quote unquote, or conspiracy theorists, to dismiss anything that went against the official narrative. They have spent the last 60 plus years attempting to disprove any kind of counter narratives, despite the fact, as I hope to show you in this episode, they were never even able to convincingly prove the official one. And it, in fact, went against nearly every shred of legitimate evidence in the case. After the Warren Commission failed to convince anyone, a second commission was assembled to examine this case along with Martin Luther King's, and it was called the U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee on Assassinations, or the HSCA, and was established in '76 in the hopes of putting all talk of a conspiracy in either of those cases to bed. It's from the determination of that very committee that I would like to read two quotes just to get us started off. In its final 1979 report, they concluded that John F. Kennedy, quote, was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. They would state the same in regards to Martin Luther King. They also believed that there was more than one shooter, but stated it was, quote, unable to identify the other gunman or the extent of the conspiracy. In truth, both of those investigations were handicapped from the start and went up against resistance out of both the FBI and the CIA. I thought that I knew the whole story, and I thought this would be a great opener that wouldn't be super research heavy. I was very wrong. It turned into a labyrinthine rabbit hole of research that led me to a lot of places I never expected to find myself. So hopefully you'll enjoy that. I'm going to do my best to present the facts as I know them to be true, with some clarifications at the end. Please forgive my voice. I'm a little bit under the weather. Do my best to get through this for you guys. I think you'll really enjoy it. And with all of that in mind, go ahead and get comfy, because we have a lot to cover. So let's get into it.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
In the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. For I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive.
In order to properly tell this story, as we usually do, First, we need to go back, starting with Chapter 1, Family Ties. Joseph Joe P. Kennedy, JFK's father, made the family fortune largely off of bootlegging and working with the Mafia to do so. The Mafia ran the bootlegging game after Prohibition had banned the sale of alcohol, and it opened up a vacuum to be filled by bootleggers. Joe had groomed Joe Jr., JFK's older brother, to be the first Catholic president, but when he was killed during World War II, John became thrust into the position instead. John and Robert were both keenly aware that the U.S. was deeply involved with organized crime, since their father had worked with the mob to make their fortune. In the late 1950s, they learned that their dad was in serious trouble. That trouble stemmed from the alleged crossing of the Purple Gang, which was the Jewish Mafia of New York. They had allegedly put a hit out on Joe. Joe would turn to the one man he knew with enough juice to get the hit called off, Sam Giancana, whom he had done business with for years during Prohibition, and was the boss of the Chicago outfit, aka the Southside Gang, aka Chicago Crime Family / Chicago Mafia. Sam was well aware of Joe's political aspirations for his boys, so he agreed to help under the condition that should John be elected president, then the pressure that those boys and the government had been putting on the mob would be relaxed. Giancana was assured that if he had saved Joe's life, that the Kennedy boys would feel indebted to him and would help to lessen the pressure that had been recently put on the mob by the government through the U.S. Senate Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, or as it is better known as, the McClellan Commission, which was formed on January 30th, 1957 and dissolved on March 31st of 1960. Its focus was to study the extent of criminal or other improper practices in the field of labor management relations, and to recommend law changes that would better protect U.S. workers and industries against the influence of such practices or activities. RFK was appointed assistant counsel for the Committee on Government Operations by the chairman at that time, Senator Joseph McCarthy. He would resign from that position on July of '53, but rejoined as chief minority counsel in September of '54 and would go on to be the committee's chief counsel. Shortly after, the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the U.S. Senate Committee on Government Operation under leadership of John L. McClellan would begin holding hearings into labor racketeering and the Mafia's takeover of the powerful trade union, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. This all leads into the scandal surrounding Midwestern Teamster leader Jimmy Hoffa, and that is a deep and winding rabbit hole for another day, trust me. But what it led to was a significant factor in the creation of the committee, which Robert Kennedy was a head figure of. Although he proved to be largely ineffective and inexpert in the field of interrogating witnesses and properly laying out cases that the Justice Department would take up to actually prosecute, Kennedy would, however, still investigate a wide range of labor unions and corporations, proving to be a major thorn in the side of organized crime. Giancana, still believing that the brothers would ultimately feel indebted to him at least, would work hard to pull them both under his sphere of influence and onto his side. This would initially prove at least somewhat successful through Peter Lawford, who would marry one of the Kennedy's sisters, Patricia Kennedy, I believe, and then Frank Sinatra would establish relationships with both of the men in varying degrees. Sinatra would even put together and perform campaign jingles such as "Everyone is voting for Jack." Giancana felt like, and would boast per his usual fashion, that he had everything under control, assuring others that once Kennedy was in the Oval Office, the pressure would cease, and in time he would be a friend to the Mafia. He had placed several of his boys close to the brothers, and they would be seen together with them frequently, and partying together in the lead up to the election. There were also rumors that JFK had some sort of relationship with Sam Giancana's girlfriend, Judith Exner. Exner, who claimed to have been a mistress of both men, and asserted that she was a sort of conduit between the two men. Well, I guess that's one way to put it. Potentially facilitating communications related to alleged CIA mafia plots, such as those concerning Fidel Castro. Yes, the CIA had frequent arrangements with the mob during this time in history. The most significant of which, as I will soon break down, is a key factor in this story. JFK, it would seem, was simply playing Giancana and using his influence to further propel himself towards the presidency. In return, JFK would give Giancana FBI reports on mob bosses to give him the impression that law enforcement wasn't well informed about the mafia's plans and movement, and were actually disinterested altogether. The reports he was receiving, however, were cherry-picked by Kennedy and likely incomplete. By doing this, JFK was simply tricking Giancana Giancana and giving him a false sense of security and the impression that JFK was trying to help him, when in truth he was not. Once elected, Kennedy would abruptly cut ties with Sinatra and begin freezing Giancana out. It would seem that JFK had played Giancana and the Mafia and also beat them at their own game, a dangerous game, and a dangerous and unprecedented move at this time in history, a time when nearly all of the major American oligarchs, rich oil men, captains of industry, the bankers, and intelligence community, particularly their leaders, were nearly all corrupt, nearly all crooks themselves, with two of the biggest heading up the CIA and FBI. J. Edgar Hoover was one of the worst. He was the top dog in law enforcement at that time. When JFK would appoint his younger brother RFK to the position of Attorney General, it sent shockwaves throughout the world of organized crime, as well as the corrupt forces that had, by this time, effectively seized total control of the shadow government, and were the ones who really pulled the strings behind the scenes of U.S. power. This proverbial shot across the bow, if you will, finally drove it home with these people that Kennedy wasn't, in fact, on their side, and was largely incorruptible by them. This caused a bit of panic throughout both the world of organized crime and the shadow government, and would ultimately set into motion the wheels of treachery and treason that would, in time, crush both brothers beneath them. The final blow against JFK, however, actually happened before the election ever took place, when he was stuck with Lyndon B. Johnson as his running mate. Johnson was as corrupt as they come, and he had been long before his political career ever took off. I don't want to get too bogged down with him because there's so much there, but I do feel that since he played such an integral role in this story, some background is at least required in order to fully grasp the breadth of this conspiracy and how it was accomplished. Chapter 2. Lyndon Baines Johnson. From the Box 13 scandal that originally put him into the Senate in 1948 U.S. Senate elections in Jim Wells, Texas, through his questionable swearing in to take over the role of president after Kennedy's death, treachery seemed to be the one reliable constant in matters concerning him. To give a quick rundown of just some of the events that showed his true character and how far he would go to get what he wanted, would honestly do a disservice to the real story of just how disgraceful he really was. But I'll do my best to paint that picture. Not a ton is known about his early life, and what is known isn't particularly important to this story. But he came from humble beginnings, though, so I'll give him that. But what he was willing to do to advance his career is a subject that is still contested today. His political career truly began in earnest with his election to the U.S. Senate in the 48 elections. It was a hotly contested battle for votes, and there's evidence out there for those inclined to look that Johnson made some less than savory connections and bedfellows in order to secure those votes. This isn't even where the scandal lies, though. It was a neck-and-neck race between the Democratic primary frontrunners, LBJ and Coke Stevens. On the day of the runoff election, the first round of voting was ruled inconclusive, which is kind of another story in itself, but we won't get into that for this. Lost the nomination to Coke until 6 days after the polls had closed, when lo and behold, 202 extra votes seemingly appeared out of nowhere and were added to totals for Precinct 13, Jim Wells County. Of those, there were 2 more votes for Stevenson and 200 more for LBJ, just enough to give Johnson a very narrow victory. This would result in a scandal that became to be known as the Box 13 scandal. Furthering the doubt of the vote's legitimacy was the fact that the names added to the end of the tally were in alphabetical order and written in the same pen and handwriting. Some of the supposed voters insisted that they never even voted when questioned about it in a subsequent investigation. The last person who voted before all of those questionable in alphabetical order votes stated that he voted right before the polls closed and that there was no one else in line behind him. Stevenson would dispute the election, taking it all the way to the Supreme Court, who would rule in favor of LBJ on the basis that naming a nominee rested with the state and not the federal government. A private investigator would later uncover that LBJ conspired with George Parr, a Dem Party leader in Texas, to fake the extra votes. By this time, however, LBJ had already gone on to beat out the Republican nominee, Jack Porter, to secure his seat in the Senate. The Box 13 scandal would follow Johnson throughout his career and be an often cited event by his many detractors. All but forgotten, it still remains the scandal that researchers will name first and foremost when discussing LBJ. The truth is, that incident pales in comparison to all of the real dirt out there on LBJ. Here are just a few brief mentions for you to look deeper into, should you feel so inclined. Part 1. Murders. several questionable deaths have been linked to LBJ's thirst for political power. The first of those that I was able to corroborate with a questionable trail back to him came shortly after the Box 13 scandal, when Sam Smithwick, who was a one-time deputy sheriff, wrote to Coke Stevens in early '52 to inform him that he was now ready to testify about the election fraud and that he could provide the missing ballot box that Clerk Louis Salas was thus far able to keep out of the legal proceedings. Smithwick was serving a prison sentence at this time after being convicted of murdering a local talk radio host, William H. Mason, who had criticized the man that Sheriff Smithwick worked for, that was also a county judge named George Parr, who was more of a mob-style ward boss of the old political system locally. Before he could testify, however, guards would corner him in his cell, strangle him, and leave him hanging from the bars on the cell's gate. Of course, the prison coroner immediately ruled a suicide. Any of this sound familiar? But according to the few remaining reports on the killing, it, quote, stunk to high heaven and, quote, reeked of corruption. In '56, Governor Allen Shivers would go as far as to give a speech accusing Johnson of setting up the murder, but charges were never made. McClellan, who we spoke of earlier, would say that the murder was set up following the '48 election, when Johnson's attorney, an unscrupulous man that was called the secret political boss of Texas by Reader's Digest, Hubert Hardison Pete Cofield, would get appointed to serve on the State Board of Prisons. McClellan also went on to write about secret guard squads appointed to control and eliminate problematic inmates. According to McClellan, Mac Wallace, a man we will discuss more in a sec, functioned as Johnson's favorite hitman, and Johnson would fly him on military planes to disguise all traces of him traveling for him. Wallace was an ex-Marine, as well as a stone-cold killer. On October 22, 1951, 1 week after his 30th birthday, he walked into the clubhouse of an Austin golf course, ordered a pack of smokes, and then promptly shot the attendant behind the counter. The man was John Douglas Kinzer, and he was a World War II vet, as well as an amateur actor who had allegedly been sleeping with his wife, Mary Andre, and LBJ's sister, Josepha. What a name. Wallace had discovered that his wife and Josepha were active in Austin's underground gay culture. Kinzer knew too much about LBJ's sister's scandalous sex life and had to go. Wallace also clearly had his own intentions as well. Josepha, according to contemporary sources, had a habit of being a little loose with her words when she was drinking, and allegedly told Kinzer about underhanded dealings between George Brown, a co-founder of Brown and Root, and LBJ. Brown had largely financed Johnson's political career, and in return was handed huge construction contracts for his company, which was filled with CIA assets, according to declassified documents that revealed both Herman and George Brown were assets of the CIA's Clandestine Services Division. I included a few of those documents in this week's episode, Document Dump, so go ahead and check those out if you want. In February of '52, Wallace would be convicted of the murder, a charge that in Texas carried a mandatory death sentence. But he was given a 5-year suspended sentence and walked out of the courtroom a free man. After the sentencing, several of the jurors would call Kinzer's parents to apologize and say that they only reached that decision due to threats made against their families. Wallace would continue working for LBJ in various capacities, including a cushy economist position with the Department of Agriculture, a job secured for him by LBJ. Wallace himself would end up dead many years later once he had surpassed his usefulness in what many feel was a questionable auto accident. Number 2 on the LBJ murder list was Henry Marshall, perhaps one of the most compelling deaths that can be tied to Johnson. Marshall was a 51-year-old former clerk with the Robertson County office of the Agriculture Adjustment Agency. In 1960, he was asked to investigate the activities of Billy Sol Estes, a wealthy benefactor of Johnson's, who had been found to have engaged in an illegal scheme to buy cotton allotments. Estes had been tapped by LBJ to raise money in his bid to defeat JFK in the 1960 Democratic primary, but they had close ties dating back over a decade before that. Estes would later admit, following his release in 1984, that he had served as LBJ's cutout for $10 million in illegal kickbacks. So when LBJ needed large sums of cash, Estes would simply supply that cash. After a meeting with John P. Dennison, Estes' attorney, Marshall was offered a promotion and a salary bump under the condition that he relocate to Washington and drop his investigation. Marshall, a man who actually had some morals, made the mistake of refusing this bribe. A few months later, Marshall would be found dead in what would be ruled as perhaps the most controversial and unlikely suicide in history. Ruled by Robertson County Sheriff Howard Stiegel, who declared his death a suicide, despite the fact that he had his eye split open, a broken arm, and had been shot in the chest 5 times with a lever-action long rifle. Stiegel also had a close relationship with Clifton Carter, who was Johnson's connection to the Texas Mafia. His cousin, Glenn Stiegel, also worked in the executive office building of Vice President Johnson's offices next door to the White House. This suicide ruling was also made despite no pictures being taken during the sham of an investigation, no blood sample from the blood found on both sides of his dented truck, no fingerprinting, and no suicide note. Not to mention the gunshots, arm, and being beaten so bad that his eye had been bust from its socket, and at least 3 of the 5 shots were ruled to have been lethal, debilitating shots. Senator McClellan would also look into this case and hold a hearing where he stated, after attempting to hold the gun in the purported position, quote, "It doesn't take many deductions to come to the irrevocable conclusion that no man committed suicide by placing this rifle in that awkward position and then cocking it 4 more times," end quote. Even highly compromised and corrupt FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover didn't buy the official narrative's impossible conclusion. In 1984, former Texas Attorney General Will Wilson would tell the Dallas Morning News that federal offices refused to comply and aid the state of Texas' own investigation into Marshall's death, which was, in his educated opinion, very much a murder and not a suicide. The U.S. Department of Justice at that time, headed up by Robert F. Kennedy, refused to turn over a 175-page Department of Agriculture file and various other reports and documents. RFK, while no fan of Johnson, most likely did so realizing that having the vice president to his own brother being revealed to have connections to a scandal and a crook such as Estes, along with the murder of a government official, would be a bit of a bad look for the Kennedy administration and the bid for the 1964 re-election. Even if Johnson was, as several inside sources have suggested, dropped from the pre-election ticket. Billy Sol Estes would be convicted in '65 for mail fraud and tax evasion. After his release, however, Estes would decide to testify before the grand jury regarding Marshall's murder. Estes would tell them what had been obvious all along, that Marshall was murdered over fears that he would expose Estes' cotton allotment scam, but suggested that it was by orders of the then and newly elected Vice President LBJ due to fears that Marshall could link him to Estes' scams and frauds. The order allegedly went through Clifton C. Carter, who is a story unto himself and had run Johnson's Senate campaign. He was also a key figure in other quote-unquote dirty work for Johnson around those years. Estes also detailed that the allotment scam was ordered by Carter as repayment for large campaign contributions. On January 17th of 1961, Marshall addressed Estes' lawyer, John Dennison, stating that the allotment scheme was illegal and that it would be investigated. According to Estes' testimony, a few days later, he, Johnson, Carter, and Mac Wallace, the hitman for Johnson, would meet up in Johnson's backyard of his home in Washington, D.C. to plot Marshall's death. The plan was for Wallace to kill Marshall and to make it look like a suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning, which would explain the otherwise out-of-place bag that appeared to have been placed around his head at some point, and very high levels of carbon monoxide in his blood. According to Estes, Wallace and Marshall ended up in a scuffle, with Wallace coming out on top, wrapping the bag over Marshall's head and around the exhaust pipe of Marshall's truck. However, upon hearing a car coming, he would panic and just shoot him instead 5 times. The suicide verdict was already in place though, and this is how we ended up with one of the least likely suicide rulings I've ever seen. After his testimony, the Robertson County grand jury would unanimously vote to overturn the suicide verdict. The state judge would order that the suicide death certificate to be changed to homicide. LBJ would never be officially charged though. Surprise, surprise. Johnson was always a problem, from his start as an unruly class bully, with his violent tendencies showing early in his life, including an incident where he took dynamite and used it to blow up a dog in the Johnson City town square. Bastard. All throughout his life, he was known to be crass, vulgar, and controlling, with a violent and explosive temper. He would hone his powers of cunning and manipulation, and use them in his insatiable quest for power. Many of his contemporaries viewed him as a monster, but rarely do you hear that discussed by historians. There is a long list of suspicious murders that took place around Johnson's rise to power, or seemingly in the service of him maintaining that power and avoiding legal troubles. A list that by many accounts includes his own sister, Josepha, who at 49 attended a Christmas Eve party at LBJ's ranch and died during the night of an alleged cerebral hemorrhage. Despite state law requiring an autopsy, one was never conducted, and the doctor who signed her death certificate never even examined her body. On the 26th, 2 days later, she was hastily buried on LBJ's ranch. According to Estes, he was told by Cliff Carter that she had been poisoned at the party because she had become a liability. While she kept quiet regarding Kinzer's murder, there were still plenty of reports of her tendency to drink and begin talking about everything she knew about her brother and his associates, including LBJ's illegitimate son, Rodney White, whom she was helping to raise at the time. Carter himself would die of supposed pneumonia, despite no records of him being sick prior, and many who speculate that it was caused by cyanide, with the symptoms of which at lower doses closely mimic and can even turn into pneumonia. A subject we may or may not talk more about on certain celebrity deaths later in the season. There's so much more that I could get into regarding LBJ, but it would end up taking probably this whole episode to fully cover it. The moral of this chapter, I feel, has been communicated well enough at this point. Johnson was an unscrupulous, power-hungry man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted, or to hold on to it once he had it. He was never content playing second fiddle to Kennedy, and held great resentment that his party had put Kennedy in front of him for the presidency. And that brings us to a very important chapter in all of this. Chapter 3. Castro, Bay of Pigs fiasco, the CIA, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1959, Cuban revolutionary Fidel Castro, along with Ernesto Che Guevara and a group of like-minded Marxist-Leninists he previously called the Movement, would finally overthrow Batista's right-wing governmental dictatorship after a 3-year-long guerrilla war. He didn't do so alone, however. In 1957, Batista's regime was doing all it could to squash the rebel groups with mass arrests, torture, and extrajudicial executions. I had to say that 3 times, just so y'all know. Or, in non-political terms, murder. Castro would come to the U.S. looking for help, where he would be monitored by Batista's agents, and the first of many failed attempts on his life would be made. He would narrowly make it back, retreating into Cuba's Sierra Maestra Mountains, where he learned only 19 rebels had made it there, the rest being captured or killed. He would slowly build his forces back and arm them by doing raids on small outposts while trying to not kill unless they absolutely had to, and oftentimes patching up the injured troops. The CIA had been secretly playing both sides of the conflict already, but at this point, they would directly lend a hand to Castro, a hand that came in the form of one of the 5 Watergate burglars, CIA operative Frank Sturgis. Sturgis would offer to train Castro recruits in guerrilla warfare, and Castro would accept his offer. Worse than his need for training, however, was his need for more weapons, and fast. Sturgis was more than happy to assist, and effectively took up the role of gunrunner for the anti-Batista movement, buying literal boatloads of guns and ammo from the CIA weapons expert Samuel Cummings, and his International Armament Corp in Alexandria, Virginia. Ambassador to Cuba E.T. Smith, who felt the CIA had gotten too close to the socialist movement, would still personally go to Batista to inform him that the U.S. would no longer support him and felt that he could no longer control the situation in Cuba. By 1959, the revolution prevailed, and Castro began reforming Cuba, much to the chagrin of many U.S. power players. By the summer of 1959, Castro started nationalizing plantation lands owned by American investors, as well as nationalizing sugar production and oil refinement, sending U.S. companies such as Coca-Cola up in arms at the loss of the low-cost sugar imports that they had long enjoyed off the backs of cheap Cuban labor. Castro would help appoint and remove several presidents while acting as prime minister, resisting placing himself solely in charge. Castro would also work to push social projects in hopes of raising Cuba's standard of living, placing those above economic development and outside interests. This would prove a costly mistake in the eyes of powerful U.S. oligarchs. He would also foster close relations with the USSR, with whom he shared the belief in Marxist-Leninist socialism. The USSR, who was deep in a Cold War with the U.S. at this point, would develop trade relations with Cuba. The Cuban government would order the country's refineries, which were controlled by U.S. companies Shell and Esso at the time, to start processing Soviet oil instead, but they refused under the tremendous U.S. pressure. Castro would expropriate and nationalize the refineries in response, and the U.S. canceled its import of Cuban sugar as retaliation. This would provoke Castro to nationalize most U.S.-owned and controlled assets in the country, including banks and sugar mills. From this point on, relations between the U.S. and Cuban governments only got worse. Castro feared being on the receiving end of yet another U.S. CIA-backed coup and began to heavily invest in Cuba's military. Relations between Cuba and the U.S. would continue to trend downward and were dealt another blow when a French vessel, the La Coubre, would explode in the Havana harbor on March 4th of 1960. The ship was carrying weapons that Castro had purchased from Belgium at the time of its destruction, killing between 75 to 100 people, depending on who you ask. While as far as U.S. sources were concerned, the disaster is unexplained. A brief look at a few other circumstances makes it pretty clear what happened and why, though. By this time, counter-revolutionary forces and spy networks linked to the CIA had spread out all throughout Cuba. The U.S. was also doing all it could to block other countries from helping to arm Cuba. In Belgium, a U.S. diplomat and military attaché had done all that they could to pressure the government into stopping this arms deal, but the National Factory of War Arms eventually resisted the U.S. pressure and arranged the deal with Cuba anyway. The U.S. was clearly none too happy about this. The La Coubre sailed from Antwerp, Belgium, and was carrying bullets, anti-tank, and personnel grenades for the FAL rifles that were purchased from Belgium previously. The U.S. had already intervened, preventing Cuba from purchasing British fighter jets. For the record, the La Coubre was a 4,310-ton freighter with a 28-man crew under experienced Captain George Dalmas, and was carrying 783 tons of general cargo, and her number 6 store contained 76 tons of weapons, including 1,492 crates of those FAL grenades. She would sail from Antwerp, passing through the U.S., Mexico, and Haiti along the way. Though fairly uncommon for a ship transporting weapons, she also had passengers on board, including a French Dominican friar and an American photojournalist named Donald Lee Chapman. A North American family also boarded at the Everglades, bound for Havana. Typically, the way dangerous cargo is unloaded is to anchor the main freighter outside of a port and then use smaller boats called lighters to transport the cargo. This time, however, Captain Dalmar was ordered to bring the ship into the Pan American dock to unload. Experienced stevedores with much experience in handling weapons did most of the work, assisted by Cuban soldiers, customs officials, and CGT supervised. At roughly 12:30 p.m., the second shift arrived and took over unloading 20 crates before an explosion rocked the ship at 3:10 p.m., destroying the ship's stern. Military chiefs, firefighters, police, and medical personnel, including former Dr. Che Guevara, came to the scene to help out. Other government officials would follow shortly behind to get a grasp on what had happened. At 3:40, the second, even larger explosion hit, killing and injuring many of those who had come to render aid and injuring many more. 6 French crewmen would die, and of the 101 declared dead or missing, 34 would never recover. The following day, Castro would give a fairly famous speech at the funeral that was held for the 27 dead dock workers, and where he would publicly proclaim that the U.S. and specifically the CIA were responsible. They did indeed have both motive and opportunity, since the La Coubre was once repaired while it was in Newport, Virginia, from January 6th to the 18th, and had docked in Miami before coming to Cuba, an area where the CIA was already in the process of using Cuban exiles to cause destabilization and to foment the need for further action in Cuba. On March 7th, 3 days later, the Miami Herald would run a cover story that an American allegedly saw a dock worker set the blast, but provided no proof, and the timing didn't fit with the timeline of events. The U.S. would blame careless handling of the munitions by dock workers for that disaster, despite this being virtually impossible. Grenades were packed with safety pins through the fuse assembly, preventing accidental detonation, and no one, especially the dock workers who would be closest to the blast, would have handled them carelessly. Even if they had, again, they wouldn't have detonated. To test the theory, Castro had 2 crates of the grenades dropped from a plane at 400 and 600 feet. While the crates broke, and some lodged deeply into the ground, all the grenades remained intact and undetonated, further ruling out the U.S. excuse. Needless to say, this event did no favors in the Cuban and U.S. relations. Castro would end his speech with "Patria o muerte," or "fatherland or death," a phrase that he would utter many times in the following years. Emboldened by their success in the 1954 Guatemalan coup d'etat and previous successes in Cuba following the La Cubre disaster, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to overthrow Castro's government and authorized a $13 million budget, as well as permitting them to ally with the Mafia, an alliance that would pop up a few times, including a few years later, since the mob was already pissed at Cuba for Castro's closing of their brothels and casino businesses across Cuba. In January of '61, Castro ordered Havana's U.S. Embassy to reduce its staff of 300, many of whom he suspected of being spies. The U.S. would respond by ending all diplomatic relations and increasing CIA funding for exiled Cuban dissidents, who the U.S. had organized and funded to attack ships that traveled to Cuba, as well as bombing factories, shops, and sugar mills. Both Eisenhower and now Kennedy supported a CIA plan to aid dissident militia force, the DRF, or Democratic Revolutionary Front, as in a CIA front, to invade and overthrow Castro, a decision that would culminate in the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. On April 15th of 1961, CIA supplied B-26 bombers would drop bombs on 3 Cuban military airfields. The U.S. would use the cover story that the ones responsible were defecting Cuban Air Force pilots acting on their own volition, but Castro would quickly expose the claims as a false flag and misinformation. The CIA and DRF put together a 1,400-man offensive called Brigade 2506 and staged them in Nicaragua, a place rich with CIA interventionist history, as we discussed some in last season in the Octopus series. On the night of April 16th and into the 17th, this Brigade 2806 would land along Cuba's Bay of Pigs and engage with a local revolutionary militia in a battle. Castro would launch a counteroffensive, bombing the brigade's ships and overwhelming the invading forces. By the 20th, he had forced the brigade to surrender and ordered 1,189 captured fighters to be interrogated by a panel of journalists on live TV, before personally taking over the interrogations on April 25th. 14 would be tried for crimes committed before the revolution, and the rest were returned to the U.S. in exchange for an estimated $25 million in food and medicine. There's really a lot more to that whole story, but we might break that down in a BTR at a later point. For now, you may be wondering what all this has to do with the Kennedy assassination, and I hear you. But to understand how it all went down and why, I need to break down a bit of history first and set the scene so I can best explain the cause, motivations, key players, and the catalyst that led to his death. The real trouble for Kennedy started with the Bay of Pigs, when Kennedy refused to send in U.S. military support for the invasion, angering an already growing group of detractors who were beginning to see JFK as a bigger and bigger problem, and a liability for their future plans. Before I get too far ahead of myself, though, we have one more key event that we need to touch on, that being the event that would come to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. A major event that further put Kennedy at odds with the deep state and likely was a key factor in the decision-making to have him removed. By 1962, Castro's Cuba was reaching dire economic straits. A volatile mixture of misguided economic choices, a dropping of productivity, driven even lower by the trade embargo that the U.S. had put in place, was leading to massive food shortages, and the rationing that resulted from that had led to protests. From 62 to 68, Castro would double down on his open beliefs in socialism due to a close reliance on Russia and the alliance that he had formed between the two socialist governments. Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev wanted to even the balance against NATO and install Soviet R-12 MRBM nuclear missiles in Cuba, while conflicted about allowing the Soviets in Cuba, knowing that it would likely trigger a response by the U.S. Castro would agree in hopes that it could guarantee Cuban safety, while furthering the cause of a more united socialist order. This would be done in secret, with only Castro's closest associates knowing that it was going down. When the U.S. aerial reconnaissance discovered the missiles by that October, the U.S. would move to further isolate Cuba by implementing an island-wide quarantine so that they could search vessels that were headed to Cuba. This was the beginning of the crisis. The U.S. feared an offensive strike, though Castro assured them that it was only for defense against further U.S. invasion attempts. Castro wanted the Soviets to launch a strike should that invasion take place, but Khrushchev was more interested in avoiding an all-out nuclear war if at all possible. A deal would be struck between Khrushchev and America that he would remove all missiles in exchange for the U.S. making a commitment not to invade Cuba, as well as an understanding that the U.S. would also remove their MRBMs from Turkey and Italy. Castro was incensed that this deal was agreed to without him. and would instead go on to propose a 5-point plan. He demanded that the U.S. abandon Guantanamo Bay Naval Base, stop its support of dissident forces, cease violating Cuban airspace and waters, and end its embargo against Cuba. He would give his demands to a visiting Secretary General of the UN, U Thant, but the U.S. ignored him. Castro would refuse the UN's inspection team from entering Cuba. In the end, the standoff lasted only 12 days, from the 16th to the 28th of October, but would widely be considered the closest that the Cold War ever got to becoming hot and turning into an all-out nuclear war. Now, if you'll afford me a bit longer to give you the more accurate, less-known version, based on in-depth document searches, I'll finish painting the full story of the lead-up to the assassination. During his rise to power in the mid-20s, Italian fascist dictator Benito Amilcare Andrea Mussolini came to view the mafia as a threat to his fascist regime. And in June of 24, he would entrust his iron prefect, Cesare Mori, to round up and eradicate the mafia from Sicily. And on October 25th of 1925, he would appoint Mori the prefect of the Sicilian capital, Palermo. By 1928, over 11,000 suspects were arrested, leading to the conviction and imprisonment of more than 1,200, with many others being exiled without a trial. Later, during World War II in 1942, the U.S. Mafia had seized massive control in the same way that they had in Sicily, by buying up and funding politicians and infiltration of the justice system. They were accomplishing much at a street level, but had no control over the U.S. military or media at this time. That would begin to change with the sinking of the SS Normandy, done so under the orders of the Gambino crime family mobster with huge sway over the labor rackets in the Brooklyn dockyard, Antonio Anastasia. When mob boss Lucky Luciano was finally imprisoned for pandering, of all things, Anastasio began hatching a plan for his freedom. The Navy was concerned at the time about the danger of possible acts of sabotage against warships berthed at the Brooklyn and Manhattan docks. Anastasia, along with his brother Albert, would seek to strike up a deal with the Navy to release Luciano in exchange for the mob guaranteeing the safety of the naval ships. To convince the Navy to be concerned, the brothers had been aware that for several months U.S. Navy intel agents had been watching the Brooklyn and Manhattan waterfront, trying to spot Italians and Germans who could potentially be involved in a sabotage plot to disrupt Navy shipping. At that time, a French luxury liner, the SS Normandy, was docked at the Hudson River Pier, while quickly being converted to a troop and supply transport. The fire that broke out on board on February 9th of 1942 would become one of the most memorable fires to ever occur in New York history. The Normandy would burn for hours as fireboats poured water into the raging blaze aboard it. From the damage and the subsequent water it took on, the ship would begin to list heavily to its port side before eventually capsizing along the pier. The pictures of the disaster are crazy, by the way. The ship's destruction would lead the Navy to approach the mob about guaranteeing that there would be no sabotaging of shipping from New York Harbor. As a reward for his, quote, patriotic support in agreeing to this from jail, Luciano would be transferred from the maximum security prison at Dunamore to the Great Meadow minimum security prison, and the U.S. military began its long-running relationship with the Mafia. After the Italian purge and U.S. crackdowns that led to the arrest of Luciano, the mob had been weakened and could have possibly been put down for good. After this agreement, however, the mob would enjoy a major resurgence and begin its relationship with not only the military, but more specifically U.S. intelligence, and began the takeover of areas like never before. After being later released from jail, Luciano would be deported, but he would still develop a relationship with the recently officially created Central Intelligence Agency, particularly in the areas of drug smuggling and gun running, leading to the CIA becoming one of the world's leading import and exporters of narcotics, using the profits, as we also discussed in the Octopus series, to fund coups and secret wars the world over, which enabled their partners within the military-industrial complex to sell more weapons than ever before. During this boom, the same group of men who had played both sides and helped fund Hitler, the Harriman brothers, Rockefeller, Prescott Bush, and others, men who truly became the greatest enemies of liberty and true democracy around the world. They would dip their feet even deeper into the Nazi waters by employing many of the former Nazi intel officers who were out of a job at the close of World War II, while helping the military compete with Russia to scoop up as many Nazi scientists as possible under Operation Paperclip, helping them avoid prosecution for war crimes that they deserved to face. Since the financiers had virtually paid for Nazi Germany, they seemed that it was only fair that they should get to employ whichever officers they wanted. It was under this program that the U.S. gained its first ICBMs, putting the fate of the world in the early cabal's hands. The list of Prescott Bush's dirty deeds rivals his son's, which is saying a lot. Shortly after the war ended, Prescott would place this ad in the LA Times, and this is verbatim. Wanted, desperate politician to do despicable things for cash. Apply in writing to Prescott Bush, care of Brown Brothers, Harriman. No, that's not a joke. Sadly, that happened for real. While it can't be proven anyone ever applied for this, the next politician that they started financially backing and pushing was Richard Nixon. In 1947, Nixon would come to Jewish gangster in service of the Giancana crime family, Jacob Rubenstein. If that name doesn't ring a bell, perhaps his better known alias will, Jack Ruby. Jack was a nightclub owner and deeply connected with the mob. The same men who had armed, funded both sides of the war, and profited greatly from it, realized they needed a new way to grow their wealth through global conflict. Their ties within the CIA would become their tools to achieve this aim through subversion, coups, and initiating conflict the world over, all under the guise of stopping communism from doing the same exact thing that the shadow government of the U.S. wanted to do, from taking over the world. Then destabilized country after country from Laos, Chile, El Salvador, Iran, Honduras, Vietnam, and Cuba. Any country unwilling to play ball with the business interests of this shadow government, i.e. resisting the exploitation of their labor and goods for powerful U.S. interests, would be labeled a communist threat and would soon be destabilized. After which its leadership would be replaced by someone more sympathetic to the business interests of the U.S., as well as the aims of the Mafia and the CIA. The CIA had been starting many wars since at least the end of the Second World War, keeping money flowing into the military-industrial complex and justifying its and the CIA's necessity and making its ultra-wealthy backers even more money by selling weapons and supplies to both sides. The mob would also back both politicians in any election, ensuring that they had at least some influence over the one who came out on top. The CIA has been a tool of the ultra-wealthy since virtually its inception point, as well as a frequent partner with the Mafia, as we have established. It was the world that the Kennedy brothers were brought up in and saw firsthand. It was this world that they sought to change, and ultimately, it was this world and that very commitment that would send them both to their graves. Now, back to Cuba for a second. We discussed the playing of both sides of the revolution and briefly touched on Frank Fiorini, or as he's better known, Frank Sturgis. But here's what got left out and how it all connects. It was after Castro turned to the Soviets that Sturgis switched sides once again, as the CIA and Mafia were already angry over Castro closing down casinos and fighting to remove CIA influence over his country. Sturgis would be a major force in organizing the expat Cuban dissidents who had ended up in Miami at this point. He and others within the CIA would train and organize this splinter group into a well-funded, trained and armed force to retake Cuba. The CIA's Allen Dulles, along with Harriman and Richard Bissell, another significant CIA officer who would help plan the Bay of Pigs invasion, would get together and decide the best person to help lead this coup d'etat would be none other than Prescott's eldest son, George Herbert Walker Bush, a man they were already grooming to be a significant leader in the CIA and one day political leader, and this would be his first real chance to prove that he would do whatever it takes to get the job done. George would enlist the help of fellow Texas oilman Jack Austin Crichton. Crichton, who was also a former Army intelligence officer with many deep ties to the intelligence community as a whole, and these two would join Sturgis in training and preparing the team for the Bay of Pigs invasion. More on Crichton in a bit. They were also behind Operation 40, a CIA counterintelligence op in Cuba, as well as ZR Rifle, a plan put in place to kill Castro, and some say Kennedy as well, and Operation Mongoose, an extensive campaign of terrorist attacks against civilians and covert ops carried out by the CIA in Cuba. What would come from it all was a team of ruthless assassins who were intended to kill Castro, and proposed to carry on as needed to eliminate any third world leaders who got in the way of the shadow government's plans, or American business interests. At this point, Kennedy was already in office and becoming more and more aware that the CIA couldn't be controlled and functioned more like a crime family or a mercenary group than a division of our government. The CIA had already gone behind his back. The Bay of Pigs was done without Kennedy's approval, and so he would refuse to allow U.S. air support that was planned and effectively, at least in the CIA's eyes, was the main reason that the invasion had failed. He would also order the FBI under Hoover to shut down the camps that had been used to train the Cuban dissidents. Sturgis, who narrowly escaped the Bay of Pigs with his life, was furious with Kennedy, and on national TV would give an interview calling Kennedy a, quote, stupid-ass politician for making deals behind his back and putting his life and his friends' lives in danger. One of the CIA's many attempts on Castro's life came from an unexpected place, in the form of then 19-year-old Lona Marita Lorenz, a German-born woman who would begin a love affair with Castro from 1959 until January of 1960, when she would be a part of a CIA-planned assassination that would fail. She would go on to testify regarding the JFK assassination hearings in the 70s and 80s, that she was involved with the anti-Castro Cubans, along with Sturgis and a name that longtime listeners of the podcast will no doubt recognize, E. Howard Hunt of CIA and Watergate break-in fame. In 1972, she told Paul Meskill, a reporter from the New York Daily News, that she had met Lee Harvey Oswald in the fall of 1963 at an Operation 40 safe house in Miami's Little Havana district, and also again in 1963 before the assassination in the house of Orlando Bosch with Frank Sturgis and others present. She told him that the men were studying a map of Dallas and suspected that they were planning to raid an arsenal. Lorenz also stated that she joined the men traveling to Dallas in 2 cars who were carrying 2 rifles with scopes, but that she flew back to Miami the day after they arrived because they wanted her to be a decoy, and she said that she wanted no part of it. Under deposition, Lorenz would later say in November of 1963, Sturgis asked her to come to Dallas to act as a decoy, and that Oswald and 7 anti-Castro Cubans transported weapons to Dallas just before November 22nd. Lorenz also claimed that E. Howard Hunt came to their Dallas hotel room and gave Sturgis an envelope stuffed with cash. Lorenz was a CIA-trained assassin who was recruited by Sturgis and who worked for the U.S. Intel Services and FBI multiple times throughout her life. After the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy fired Allen Dulles, Richard Bissell, and General Charles Cable for more or less using the CIA as their personal hit squad to shore up their personal interests around the world. After learning that Robert Mayhew, a former FBI agent who had sought out Sam Giancana to discuss with his underboss Johnny Roselli to discuss putting a hit out on Castro, Kennedy was furious that a government agency that is funded by U.S. taxpayers trying to work with the mafia, which he and RFK were working to put away at this point, in order to put out hits for political murders without any presidential or congressional oversight. This, along with the Bay of Pigs disaster, was the reason for him allegedly telling an advisor that he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Kennedy felt betrayed and saw in the CIA an organization that was getting larger and larger and more out of control. The CIA likewise saw Kennedy as a threat and a stumbling block that had to go. Meanwhile, Bush's oil associates, including the CIA's Richard Bissell, who had seen his purchase of Cuban land to drill for his oil company, COVT, Oil Exploration, to be reclaimed by Castro, costing him massively, as well as causing it to be delisted from the stock exchange, a total loss of nearly $30 million. So Bissell, along with other Texas oil fat cats, Clint Murchison and Harold Lafayette Hunt, knew that Kennedy was planning to repeal one of their biggest tax breaks, the oil depletion allowance. Their close associate, LBJ, was under pressure from his series of crimes at this point, as well as caught up in a new scandal involving his assistant, Bobby Baker, and feared that his career would end in shame without ever reaching his goal of the presidency, so long as Kennedy was in the way. So his part in the assassination plot, with all we've discussed considered, is pretty easy to grasp. The same Nazi sympathizers who funded both sides of virtually every war, whose disdain for JFK was well established at this point, and who now had majority control of the military-industrial complex, and who were aware of Kennedy's desire to begin de-escalating and eventually pulling out of Vietnam, were none too happy with him either. Had this been allowed, the billions that stood to gain from weapons sales would disappear. Another who stood to lose was J. Edgar Hoover, who had at this point invested millions into the Clint Murchison's Texas oil business, along with his mafia associate Vito Genovese. So, by 1963, Kennedy had many unscrupulous enemies, from the intel services, powerful businessmen, crooked politicians, and the mafia out for his head, all who wanted or needed Kennedy out of the picture. And when you take all of this into account, it starts to paint a much clearer picture regarding what really happened that day and why. Hey guys, I just wanted to pop in here real quick. I know that I've hit y'all with a whole lot of information already in this, and it's very dense and a whole lot of moving pieces, and I apologize, but I promise that all of it's very important. So if you want to take just a second, get your stretch, get a little snack, maybe some coffee in you, maybe grab a notebook so you can take a few notes of everything that's going on. Go ahead and do that. Hit pause and come back to this when you're feeling a little bit more refreshed. That was a major reason why I decided to do this in multiple parts, because it's just so much information and it's so dense with information that I figured it would be a little bit tiresome on your mind to try to get all this in one go. So if you need a break, take a break, then come back. We're about to get to the main event of everything very, very soon. And with all that backstory out of the way, hopefully you have a little bit of a clearer picture about the time that we're entering into here. Which brings us to Chapter 4, the setup. Part 1, getting the patsy in place. Now, with all the pieces that we talked about as to why, we now come to the all-important question of who and how. Between the vast network of CIA and Mafia hitmen, there was no shortage of paid killers who would be approached for this job, and who, for their own reasons, wanted or needed Kennedy out of the way for good. Both sides, however, knew that if they were implicated, or worse yet, caught in the middle in the course of killing a U.S. president, the ramifications would be massive, and the consequences would be dire. So it's little surprise that the frequently used Mafia approach of using a patsy was the most logical choice. Someone involved enough to be believable, but otherwise oblivious to the true machinations behind it all, who either lacked the knowledge to give up those truly responsible, or that could be easily silenced for good after the deed was done. So to fill in this need, the conspirators would turn to George de Mohrenschildt, an anti-communist political refugee from Russia, whose father was arrested by the Bolshevik secret police during the Russian Bolshevik October Revolution, but managed to escape while in exile. Originally George von Mohrenschildt, he would legally gallanticize the nobility particle of his name from the German von to the French de in May of 1938. He became deeply involved in the petroleum and oil business and became a close associate of the same Texas oil billionaires that we mentioned earlier. He was also a CIA field agent who moved to Dallas in October of 1961. They knew they needed a disenfranchised lowlife type, one that would at least be somewhat believable. So he would turn to low-level CIA operative who had been groomed to be precisely that, one Lee Harvey Oswald, whom de Mohrenschildt would locate and befriend during the summer of 1963. Mohrenschildt would be Oswald's handler for the operation. Oswald and his Russian-born wife, Marina, would meet de Mohrenschildt in Fort Worth, Texas. He would later testify before the Warren Commission in 1964 that he met them through an oil accountant named George Bauhe. When de Mohrenschildt asked Bauhe if it was safe to help Oswald, Bauhe told him that he had checked with the FBI. De Mohrenschildt also said that he believed he had discussed Oswald with Max Clark, whom he believed worked for the FBI, as well as J. Walton Moore, who he described as a, quote, government man, either FBI or CIA. And he had debriefed de Mohrenschildt after a previous trip that he had taken abroad. A declassified CIA document that was acquired by the House Select Committee on Assassinations would confirm that J. Walton Moore was indeed a CIA agent employed at the Domestic Contacts Division in Dallas. The work that was actually done by this division isn't completely clear. From what I've gathered, though, it functioned basically to debrief Americans who traveled overseas for work or to visit relatives, as well as recruiting for students, diplomats, and business people to be CIA agents upon returning to their home country. So one of its primary functions was basically to flip foreigners into assets, in other words. Back to Mohrenschildt. When he got to Dallas, before connecting with Oswald, he also joined the Dallas Petroleum Club, as well as the Dallas Council on World Affairs, which both helped him develop relationships with oil barons Clint Murchison, H. L. Hunt, Sid Richardson, as well as George H. W. Bush, who may have been the one to originally bring him into the working for the CIA, and all of whom had their own reasons for wanting Kennedy out of the picture. So with this, we begin to see the web forming around Kennedy, that would ultimately lead to his undoing. De Mohrenschildt would return home from a business trip in Houston around the time and realized that his home had been broken into and his papers were out of place and in such a way that he quickly was aware that someone had broken in for the sole purpose of copying his personal papers and documents, including a manuscript that he possessed at this time, which Oswald had given to him to read. His number one suspect was, obviously, the CIA. But according to him, when he approached Moore about it, Moore denied that the CIA was involved in any way. But come on, I think we all know that they were probably behind it. I mean, don't we? In October of 62, Oswald would tell Mohrenschildt that he had lost his job at Fort Worth, and Mohrenschildt would, of course, talk him into moving to Dallas and assisted him in finding employment with a Dallas photographic called Jaggers Chills Stovall. In June, Mohrenschildt would officially move to Haiti, putting him a safe distance away from the coming fallout. He would return later to testify before the Warren Commission in 64, though. Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, who was Chief Pentagon to CIA liaison officer at this time, would state that Mohrenschildt would have several private lunches with former CIA director and cover-up master of the Warren Commission, Allen Dulles, throughout his time testifying, which, for the record, was longer than any other testimony and questioning of anyone else involved. Later, in 67, he would fully move back from Haiti, and he and his wife would be interviewed by Orleans Parish District Attorney Jim Garrison as a part of Garrison's prosecution of Clay Shaw, a New Orleans businessman who was arrested and charged for conspiring to kill President Kennedy with Oswald and others. Garrison stated that both de Mohrenschildt and his wife insisted that Oswald was just a scapegoat and a patsy. He concluded from his interview that de Mohrenschildt had been one of Oswald's, quote, babysitters assigned to protect or otherwise see to the general welfare of Oswald, end quote. De Mohrenschildt would go on years later to reach out to George H.W. Bush for assistance, as he felt either the FBI or CIA was stalking him and his wife over what he disclosed about Oswald. No connection that I'm aware of, at least officially, was ever proven, but very little would surprise me. On March 29th of 1977, Mohrenschildt would state in an interview with author and investigative journalist Edward Epstein, no relation, probably, who knows, who had written several scathing critiques of how the Warren Commission had failed massively, and likely intentionally, in the investigation of the Kennedy assassination, that in 62, Dallas CIA operative J. Walton Moore and an associate of his handed him Oswald's address in Fort Worth and suggested that Mohrenschildt should meet him. He then would state, quote, I would never have contacted Oswald in a million years if Moore had not sanctioned it. Too much was at stake, end quote. Later that same day, Mohrenschildt would be given a business card from Gayton Fonzie, an investigator for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, telling him that he would like to see him. The committee considered Mohrenschildt a, quote, crucial witness, end quote. I bet if you've followed this show, or even you've just looked into enough of these types of affairs at this point, then you can probably guess what I'm about to say. You can say it with me if you'd like. That same afternoon, de Mohrenschildt would be found dead from a shotgun wound to the head. And here's the sing-along part. It was ruled a suicide. While their crucial star witness was out of the way, they did hear the testimony of William Ottmans on April 2nd of 1977, where he stated, for the record, that de Mohrenschildt had implicated himself in the conspiracy plot to kill Kennedy. Ottman's testimony would last 3 hours in a closed-door session that declassified files would later show that he had been told by de Mohrenschildt that he had disclosed all aspects of the assassination plot with Oswald, and that Oswald acted at his, de Mohrenschildt's, instructions, and that he knew Oswald was going to kill Kennedy, end quote. On July 6th of 78, Joseph Dyer would testify before the House Select Committee on Assassinations that he and de Mohrenschildt were associated with Jacqueline Lancelot. Dyer's relationship with Lancelot involved passing messages for her to people in the U.S. whom Dyer assumed were connected to the CIA. Dyer also stated that shortly after the assassination, she told him about a, quote, substantial sum of money, either $200,000 or $250,000, which for the record would equal roughly over $2 million or $2.5 million if adjusted for inflation today, had been deposited in Mohrenschildt's account. Dyer also stated that he had told him that the reason that he came to Haiti was to scout for oil, but according to Dyer, he, quote, could never figure out what he did, end quote, but expressed his belief that de Mohrenschildt had, quote, some intelligence connections, which he certainly did. De Mohrenschildt would write in an unfinished and unpublished in its entirety, aside from being available as an appendix in the HSCA report, that his dear dead friend Oswald, that he knew, was never a violent man and wouldn't have been the sort of person to kill Kennedy. While the manuscript seems largely unconcerned with Oswald's guilt or innocence for the most part, he did title it, I'm a patsy, exclamation point. I am a patsy, exclamation point. As well as stating that Oswald was, quote, a patsy not involved in any revenge, end quote, and instead points the fingers toward the mob and others. This manuscript would be edited and released under the title Lee Harvey Oswald as I Knew Him by Michael A. Ranella. Chapter 4, Part 2. The Gang's All Here. After Marita Lorenz asked Sturgis what the envelope given to him by E. Howard Hunt was for, and his subsequently telling her that it had to remain confidential this time, she left. A whole host of others would be coming to the area though, like CIA pilot Tosh Plumley, who allegedly flew in several assassins into Dallas Love Field without the benefit of ever knowing who all was on that flight. Several others would also make their way to Dallas in the days just before the Kennedy assassination, many who were instrumental to the plot or could potentially be of use. According to the testimony of Madeline Duncan Brown, LBJ's mistress and illegitimate baby mama, we know that a celebration of sorts was happening just one day before. It was allegedly to celebrate Kennedy's soon-to-be-happening passing, and those people included J. Edgar Hoover and his gay lover, Clyde Tolson, who feared losing the millions that they both had invested into their host, or Clint Murchison's, oil business. Hoover, who also knew via good old domestic spying that Kennedy wanted to remove Hoover from being the head of the FBI, as well as both Brown brothers from Brown Brothers Harriman, who, along with Cliff Carter, John Connally, and Senator Ralph Yarbrough, stood to lose massively in the lost defense contracts if Kennedy was able to pull the U.S. military out of Vietnam. Other guests included Joseph Sevilla, leader of the Dallas crime family mafia in Texas, and the Dallas Mayor Earl Cable, a CIA asset since '56 who allegedly rerouted the Kennedy motorcade through Dealey Plaza as a favor to his brother Charles, who was fired by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs invasion went tits up. Other notables, including John J. McCloy, Chase Manhattan bank chief, was also there, McCloy being a confirmed Nazi sympathizer who shared a box with Hitler at the Berlin Olympic Games in '36. Mafia head Carlos Mancello, who spent most of his time chumming it up with Giancana's boys, Jack Ruby, Richard Nixon, and Harold Lafayette Hunt. Malcolm Wallace, LBJ's preferred hitman, was also said to be there in attendance. Late that evening, LBJ would also turn up, and was said to only stay for a short time. When he came back out to speak with his baby mama, she stated in her interview that he stated, quote, "After tomorrow, those SOBs will never embarrass me again. That's no threat. That's a promise," end quote. Assumably, he was told by those in attendance that everything was in place. The following morning, JFK would fly into Dallas, landing at Love Field. He would be met there by Governor Conley and led to his car by him. As it pulls off, the first of many strange anomalies would be spotted. Which brings us, finally, to Chapter 5, The Shots Heard Around the World. 11:45 a.m., November 22nd, 1963. As Kennedy entered his open-air 1961 Lincoln Continental convertible limousine on its way to the scheduled luncheon at the Dallas Trade Mart, he seemed jovial and blissfully unaware of just how far certain people were willing to go in order to get what they want. As the limousine pulled off carrying Kennedy, First Lady Jacqueline, Texas Governor John Conley, and his wife Nellie, the standard protocol of the Secret Service at that time would be violated for the first time on that day, when Secret Serviceman Henry Joseph Rybka and Special Agent Clint Hill went to grab onto the rear handles of the vehicle per usual. Special Agent Emory Roberts would order them to stand down. You can see on the footage that when he heard the order, Rybka was visibly frustrated and confused, as this was typically one of the most important functions of the Secret Service when escorting a vehicle, especially of this style, and without exception with the president riding in it. Their removal from their position would be crucial in opening up a large field of unobstructed sightline, making an incoming shot from virtually any angle far easier to accomplish. Rather than taking their usual position, they would be forced to crowd onto the vehicle directly behind Kennedy, who had now just become a wide open target. 400 yards ahead of the motorcade was a lead car that contained Dallas PD Chief George Lumpkin, along with officers Billy Sinkle and F.M. Turner, along with Army Lieutenant Colonel George Whitmire. Lumpkin and Whitmire, who were both aware of what was coming, had also restricted the police presence in the area of Dealey Plaza. When the car paused at the intersection of Houston and Elm, Lumpkin can be seen allegedly exchanging reassurances with one of his men. Nearing the plaza, the Secret Service were given little time and authority to properly secure both the rooftops, windows, and vantage points, such as the knoll and fence area behind it. Haroldson Hunt allowed Eugene Hale Brading into the Daltex building and into the second-floor broom closet. Brading was a client of New Orleans lawyer G. Ray Gill, who also represented mafia boss Carlos Mancello at the time. Brading also had with him a getaway pilot that was under the employment of Gill as a private detective, David Ferry. As Brading opens up the window, Charles Nicoletti loads his rifle. Richard Kane, aka Richard Scalzitti, notoriously corrupt Chicago police officer in the service of Sam Giancana, hears over his radio, "Car coming, Get ready. On the other side of the door, Milwaukee Phil, aka Felix Alderizio, enforcer, bagman, hitman, and sometimes burglar, as well as Sam Giancana's underboss, along with two CIA-trained anti-Castro Cubans, Rolando Masvidal and Roland Otero, stand guard over the hallway and the door. This would be roughly the same pattern used in various buildings around the plaza: a sniper, a spotter with a radio, and an extra gunman to take over should one of the snipers decide not to go forward. Each team was guarded by more hitmen, mostly from the CIA-trained anti-Castro group. Richard Kane was also an electronic surveillance expert and wiretapper who reportedly spoke 5 languages. He was positioned on the grassy knoll alongside his childhood friend and trained killer, as well as father to Woody, Charles Harrelson. With them was Charles Frederick Rogers. Rogers was a nuclear physicist who worked in seismology for Shell Oil and was also friends with David Ferry. In the school book depository, LBJ hitman Malcolm Wallace waited to ensure that things went off without a hitch. There's another version of the setup that comes from the family of Sam Giancana, says Brading and Morgan Brown, who arrived on the 21st and stayed at Suite 301 of the Cabana Hotel, were actually the other shooters that were set up in the school book depository. Later that day, it's known that he met with Harrelson Hunt at his office and that Jack Ruby was said to be in attendance. Brading, who was also a known associate of both Carlos Moncello and David Ferry, would be caught and questioned after the assassination for, quote, acting suspiciously in the Dow Tex building. Brading would give police his alias Jim Brading and not Eugene Hale Brading, causing them to not see the lengthy rap sheet with deep ties to organized crime they should have seen. Because of this, and having no real evidence to hold him on, he would be released. He would leave and go back to his room at the Cabana, a spot that Jack Ruby would be seen at later that evening. 5 years later, Brading would pop up once again in Los Angeles when JFK's brother, Robert, would be murdered, but we will get there in just a bit. According to Giancana, it was Brading and Brown, not Oswald, who were seen in the book depository that day. Also, there in Dallas was Nixon and Bush. Nixon was staying at the Baker Hotel and allegedly just in town to attend the convention of the American Bottlers of Carbonated Beverages, as he was working as an attorney on behalf of Pepsi at the time. He would depart little more than an hour before Kennedy arrived. Bush is another story. While being spotted in the area several times and being suspected as being one of the quote-unquote tramps that were questioned and released after the assassination, Bush would contend that he couldn't recall where he was on that day, a day that was seared in the memories of all who lived through it, a day where literally anyone who was alive at that time could easily recall exactly where they were and what they were doing. Meanwhile, at the opposite end of the 6th floor of the school book depository, Frank Sturgis, who was the first to be spotted by Arnold Rowland, a man who happened to look up and see Sturgis in the window and remarked to his wife that he must be a security guard or Secret Service because he had what Rowland would describe as, in an interview, being a high-powered rifle with a large scope mounted on it, and that it seemed large in relation to the rifle. Of note here is that Oswald was said to be located on the opposite side and using a 6.5 by 52 millimeter Italian Carcano Mode 38 rifle with a scope that is very small and looks even smaller in relation to that rifle. Shortly after Rowland spots Sturgis, 15-year-old Amos Ewings would see one of the CIA/Sturgis trained Cubans, Ignacio Novosampol, Richard Randolph Carr, a steel worker who was seeking work at the new Dallas courthouse that was under construction at the time, would look from his vantage point on the 7th floor, also seeing Malcolm Wallace taking position to fire. He would be called to testify at the trial of Clay Shaw and would give a very detailed description of a man who exactly matched that of Malcolm Wallace, and described seeing him so vividly that he even mentioned his style of glasses and that he could see that they had large earpieces. As Kennedy's motorcade began making its way into Dealey Plaza, a well-orchestrated plan went into motion. The fear was, if everyone fired at once from the 6 to 7 sniper nests, then Kennedy's head would likely be completely blown off, making it far more obvious that there was more than one shooter involved. So instead, Allen Dulles and other conspirators decided it should happen in 4 stages, with the first being a single shot to the back of his head by Charles Nicoletti from the Dow Tex building. Had he been successful, the lone assassin single bullet story that they wanted would have been a pretty easy sell. Unfortunately for them, the Mafia hitman pulled his trigger a bit too early, and the bullet ricocheted off the limo's back and stuck into the curb beneath the overpass, dislodging a chunk of concrete that bounced up, scratching James Tague on his right cheek. The often cited Umbrella Man, Louis Stevens Witt, was the next player. His job was to give a clear signal should the first shot miss. As the limo approached, Witt lifted the umbrella as he had opened it high over his head before spinning it and panning the umbrella east to west. The conspirators knew, should this happen, it meant that Kennedy was quickly approaching the end of the kill zone, so after the signal, 2 snipers would fire from the front at roughly the exact same time. Harrelson, who later admitted in jail that he was responsible, would fire, striking Kennedy in the throat, while a second sniper, positioned in a culvert approximately 50 yards away, would fire, making a hole in the windshield that was later spotted by a doctor at the ER. Further evidence for this can be seen in just a few short frames of the Zapruder film, where you can plainly tell Kennedy is clutching his throat while Governor Connally appears totally composed and oblivious. This evidence alone flies in the face of the supposed magic bullet hypothesis. By this point, Kennedy was nearing the end of Dealey Plaza and still hadn't been dealt a fatal blow to his head. To prevent the nearing escape of Kennedy, an order was given to volley fire at the car. What Secret Service man Roy Kellerman, who sat in the passenger seat, would report feeling what he said was akin to a, quote, sonic boom, as the convergence of bullets zoomed to their target and around the limo. This would be about 5 seconds after JFK is hit in the throat, and when Sturgis would miss his target, hitting Connally in his back and breaking his ribs. A bullet that basic physics could plainly show came in at too sharp and too steep of an angle to have come from that position that Oswald was said to be in. During this series of shots, Eladio Del Valle fired, hitting the governor in the wrist. Weatherford shot, missing Kennedy as well, but hitting Connally in his thigh, and Nicoletti would fire once again, missing both and striking the chrome frame of the car's window, where an indentation is clearly visible, and Wallace would start shooting JFK in his upper back, causing him to lean forward in the car. Everything happened so quickly, with the majority of shots coming from quite a ways away. So it wasn't until this point that Jacqueline noticed something was seriously wrong. By this time, Kennedy was in dire straits, held upright by little more than his back brace. Having failed to get a kill shot to this point, though, the assassins would have to go with their final play before he would make it out of the line of fire. The Secret Service man who was driving the car would check behind him twice before slowing down to a near stop. That man was William Greer. There are conflicting stories as to his involvement, but nothing that can be proven. Regardless if he stopped the car to assess what was going on, or out of fear, or complicity, doesn't really matter. Either way, this is the moment of the fatal headshot. While there are those, including members of the House Select Committee, who feel that this shot came from the area of the grassy knoll, and was most likely fired by Charles Harrelson, which he also admitted to in various interviews from jail, there remains other evidence that supports the shot came from the storm drain, just in front and below where the car had slowed to a near stop. The trajectory of a bullet from this position would more closely match what would be required for Kennedy's head and neck to move up and to the left, as can be seen in the Zapruder film. It's more likely that the shot that did come from behind the fence on the knoll, that multiple witnesses testified to and caused police to run up the hill after the shooter, is the shot that missed entirely, hitting the ground and ripping up the grass near Norma Jean Lawless Hill's, aka the Lady in Red, feet, as she testified to during the Warren Commission. Unfortunately, as happened with several witnesses that refuted the official story and gave dissenting statements, there is a great deal of evidence pointing to a concerted effort to discredit Hill, who was the closest civilian witness to the final shot, as well as the immediate aftermath. At that fatal frame, 313 of the Zapruder film, Hill can be seen taking photos, which she stated were taken and overexposed, essentially whiting out any evidence that she had, and she can be seen about 21 feet away, just to the left and behind the president. Hill would later state that she was harassed, received numerous death threats, and her brake lines were cut on her car. She saw herself as a survivor who had narrowly escaped the series of, quote, mysterious deaths that were purported to have taken out other particularly dissenting witnesses to the assassination. Hill was a school teacher who avoided publicity for 25 years after her testimony, mostly out of fear. She would then come forward with more details and worked with a consultant on the 1991 Oliver Stone film JFK. Hill said she didn't initially notice that the grass was kicked up at her feet, but was informed by a Secret Service agent watching from the courthouse that he had seen a bullet strike at her feet. So back to our last point, I'm sure you're wondering, who would dare crawl into a nasty sewer to get into a position in the storm drain in order to shoot Kennedy? Something the older and more experienced mafia hitmen would likely never do. There's evidence that supports the shot being carried out by two young men who were brought in just as a failsafe, who were troubled youth just searching for some adventure to get into. According to the 2014 documentary by Francis Richard Connolly, no relation to Governor Connolly, he asserts those men as being Curtis Laverne Crayford, aka Larry Crayford, who allegedly was a brief CIA agent before being employed by Jack Ruby at his nightclub, the Carousel Club. He was also supposed to fill the role of the patsy before Oswald was brought in. The other young man that Connolly asserts was involved was Jack Allen Lawrence. Lawrence would make his way out of the sewer and up an embankment, showing up 15 minutes later at a Lincoln Motor showroom at a job that he had gotten with false references, reportedly pale, sweating, and on a warm day in Dallas covered in mud, or what appeared to be mud anyway. Ugh. Before telling two co-workers, Alvin Bogart and Robert Tater, sorry, anybody named Tater, that makes me laugh, I apologize, that he had been sick that morning before stumbling into the men's room to throw up. His co-workers felt his behavior was so out of character and suspicious that they called the Dallas PD, who would record the entire encounter, which is the only reason, really, that we know that this took place. Meanwhile, back in Dealey Plaza, chaos was erupting in the aftermath. Those involved would use this panic as cover to escape. Several pictures from that day clearly show the radio men, with walkies still clearly visible in their hands or their pockets, caught leaving the area. The CIA cleanup squad used this panic to quickly clean up and remove any evidence that could have been useful to conflict with the official narrative. Shortly after, Rogers, Harrelson, and E. Howard Hunt would be found hiding in boxcars of the nearby train that they were planning to use to escape. A key witness and railway dispatcher, Lee Bowers, unknown to the three men, had ordered that the train not move. The three would be photographed multiple times, as there are photos of the three being taken to the Dallas courthouse for questioning. These would go on to be known as the three hobos. They were led to the streets by Colonel Ed Lansdale, who would secure their release and give the press the story that Oswald is the main and seemingly only suspect and who acted alone. The assassination was truly a disaster that was barely pulled off. The cover-up that would ensue was just as, if not more so, messy than the plot itself. Despite dozens of witnesses stating that the limo slowed down or even stopped completely, the Zapruder film doesn't really show it that way. As crazy as it sounds, really the most obvious answer is that there was some degree of editing done. Hollywood had, at this time, developed several techniques for editing video, masking off portions and removing frames of film to give the impression as it's being one continuous shot. One possible sign of this can be seen between the frames of 308 and 315, where the people behind the car appear as blurry doubles, yet the shadows seem very sharp and in focus. The CIA had the film and the opportunity, as well as the motivation to do all this. There were actually 2 videos taken that day, though most only know about the Zapruder film. The film shot by Orville Nix was taken from the opposite side near the corner of Main and Houston. If you compare the 2 files, you can begin to notice that the police motorcycles quickly close in on the limo as it slows to a virtual stop. Evidence of editing also appears in the Nix film as well, such as how Agent Clint Hill, who rushed to protect Jacqueline as she crawled onto the back of the car, seems to magically move sideways despite running forward. It's sort of hard to describe, but if you watch them both side by side, you will see what I'm talking about. After this, the limo speeds off again towards Parkland Memorial as the second phase truly begins. And for the sake of everyone's ears, time, and attention, I'm going to go ahead and end part 1 here. Don't worry though, part 2 will be out next week, so wait is over for new episodes for the most part. As much information as this episode has, we are nowhere near the full story yet, so please be sure to join us next week when we will dig in deeper to the cover-up, fill in some details, and try to get to the bottom of what is facts and what is fiction with the whole story. I really appreciate you all for tuning in. As always, it truly does mean the world to me, and I hope that you enjoyed this episode, and I hope that your interest is piqued enough to come back and check us out again for part 2 next week. I want to try and stick with Wednesday for new episode drops, at least for the time being. If you're listening on Spotify, be sure to double check that you are following the show and the notifications are switched on, and that way you'll always know whenever new episodes are available. Check us out on the Facebook page. I just dropped some documents there, as well as in the Discord chat. And I'll be there during and after every single episode this season to try and answer any questions that you guys might have. Otherwise, you can always email the show at clandestinradiopodcast@gmail.com or leave a comment on the Spotify page. Okay, that's pretty much all the plugs. It all really does help, and I truly appreciate it. So thanks again, and I've got a really exciting season lined up for you. I cannot wait to hear your thoughts on everything. As always, take care of yourselves out there. Take care of each other if you can. And I'll talk to you all again real soon on the next Clandestine Radio.